In this week's Torah portion, Parshat Shmot, we have Moshe's encounter at the burning bush, Moshe's encounter with God. And the Torah says in the beginning of chapter 3, Moshe haya ro'eh et tzon yitro chotno, Kohen Midyan, vayinhag et hatzon achar hamidbar, vayavo el har ha'elohim choreva. Now Moshe, tending the flock of his father-in-law Yitro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Chorev, the mountain of God. There's, according to some, there's a mountain in Sinai called that Egyptians call Jebel Musa, which in 1956, the former chief rabbi of Israel, he was the Armor Rabbi Shlomo Goren, walked up that mountain. And in his biography, it talks about how at the top, he crawled to the top. And a number of rabbis have gone up there since. The verse continues, Vayera malach Adonai elav belabat aish mitoch hasnei, vayar v'hinei hasnei bo'er ba'aish v'hasnei einenu ukal. So a messenger of God appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. One of the most famous verses in the Torah. What was happening at the burning bush, and what does it mean for our world today? Vayomer Moshe asura na ve'er'eh et hamareh hagadol hazeh madua lo yiv'ar hasnei. Moshe said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why does the bush burn up? One of my teachers, Rabbi Daniel Cohen, speaks about the significance of Moshe turning aside, asurana ve'er'eh, that at some levels there might have been other people who passed that burning bush, but Moshe was the one who turned aside. And it's sort of like a broadcast, that there is a God broadcast going on at a certain frequency, and for those who choose to tune into that broadcast, they capture the God frequency. And for those who choose to go to a different broadcast or not to tune in at all, so then they don't capture that broadcast. The verses continue. Vayar Adonai kisar lirot vayikra elav Elohim mitoch hasnei vayomer Moshe Moshe vayomer hineni. And so when God saw that he had turned aside to look, Moshe called to him out of the bush, Moshe, Moshe. He answered, hineni, which echoes the language of Avraham and others. Vayomer al tigrav halom shal ne'alecha me'al raglecha ki hamakom hazeh ata omed alav admat kodesh hu. And God said, do not come closer, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. Our world is on fire more than it's been in millions of years. Our world's on fire now. And the fires in Los Angeles are messaging to us, even though the fires in Los Angeles right now are actually relatively small in terms of how fires have been burning on planet Earth in the past few years. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of what's been happening in the past few years. In South America last year, 2024, fires mostly in the Amazon rainforest, which usually is not a place of fires, that burned approximately 86 million hectares, which is 212 million acres. In Siberia, over the past 5 years, it's estimated about 83 million acres burned. In Canada, about 45 million acres. And in Australia, in 2019, 2020, 24 million. In total, hundreds of millions of acres. Now, I grew up on an acre of land. And for those who didn't grow up on an acre of land, an acre is about the size of a football field. So 1 million acres is a tremendous amount of land, and 100 million acres is even larger. In the Pacific Palisades fire, that fire has burned 26,000 acres by comparison, and destroyed about 5,000 structures. So I want to look at this issue of fire because the Midrash describes, the Gemara in Masechet Yoma, page 21b, teaches the following. Tanu Rabbanan, it's taught in a Braita. Sheish ishot hen. There are 6 types of fire. Yesh ochelet ve'ena shota. There is a fire which consumes but doesn't drink. Ve'yesh shota ve'ena ochelet. There's one that drinks but doesn't eat or consume. It's interesting, this language of a fire eating and drinking, because the fire is extinguished by water. And this idea of it drinking, it's interesting, the Braita talks about this. V'yesh ochelet lachin kiveshin, v'yesh aish docha aish, v'yesh aish ochelet aish. And there is fire which consumes liquids but not solids, and fire that consumes solids and liquids. And there's fire that consumes wet objects like dry objects, and there is fire that repels other fire, and there is fire that consumes fire. It's a bit of a cryptic teaching from the Talmud. Fire that consumes fire. Isn't fire all-consuming? So the Gemara continues. Yesh, aish, ochelet, ve'ena shotan. So now it explains these 6 categories of fire. The category of the fire that consumes solids but doesn't consume liquids, even though the literal words in the Talmud are the fire that eats but doesn't drink. So that is our standard fire that consumes dry items but does not consume liquids or dry liquids. Shotah ve'eno ochelet, the fire that drinks but doesn't eat. Dechulin, that is the fire of the sick, that dehydrates the body but does not consume the flesh. It's interesting, in Chinese medicine, there's also there's an idea of fire in the body. And a person who has a condition of fire has excess heat, according to Chinese medicine. The third category, Ochelet v'shota de Eliyahu. Dichtiv ve'et hamayim asher bat Allah lichecha. Fire that consumes solids and consumes liquids is the fire of Eliyahu Hanavi, as it is written, and fire fell from the sky and consumed the offering and the wood and the stones and the earth and licked up the water that was in the trench. A verse from Sefer Malachim Aleph. The fourth category, Ochelet lachin kiveshin dimaracha. Fire that consumes wet objects. Like dry objects is the fire of the arrangement of the wood in the Beit HaMikdash, for the offerings in the Beit HaMikdash. The fifth category, Yesh aish docha aish de Gavrio. There's a fire that repels fire, which is the fire of the angel Gavrio. V'yesh aish ochelet aish di Shechina. The last category is the fire that consumes fire, which is the fire of the Shechina, the immanent presence of God. De Amar Mar Hoshit etzba'o beinehem usrafan. As the Master said in another context, the Holy One, blessed be He, extended His finger between the angels who are also made of fire and burned them. So that at some level, the Shechina, this all-encompassing fire, whatever that means, it's not a physical fire that it's talking about here, consumed the angels that are also an aspect of fire. Okay, so the fire of the divine presence consumed the fire of the angels. Now it's interesting that in our tradition, on Shabbat, the way that we enter Shabbat, before we enter Shabbat, we light candles, which is we light fire. And the way that we end Shabbat, after Shabbat, is we again light fire with Havdalah. And so fire is the demarcation of Shabbat. We demarcate this sanctuary in time through fire. before Shabbat and after Shabbat. Because at some level, the use of fire is the most significant human invention. In fact, the Midrash says that after Shabbat, the first Shabbat on planet Earth, after God created Adam and Chava, that Adam did Havdalah after inventing or receiving fire from God. Now, in our world today, humans use fire in myriad ways. Electricity is actually fire. It's a form of fire, and the electricity that we're using now is powered by a large fire that is burning at the Hadera power plant, which has 4 large columns that you can see if you pass Hadera, and is burning gas that's extracted in the Mediterranean Sea. And that fire, a huge fire, is actually powering the lights here, as well as millions of other lights and devices, computers. On Earth right now, among the 8.2 billion people, there are actually over 1 trillion devices that are being powered by fire, whether it's cars and trucks and airplanes and factories, lights, etc. So Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan explains these 6 types of fire in a bit of a different way. He says that they are normal physical fire, biological fire, which is the fire in the human body of the fever, heavenly fire, divine fire, spiritual fire, and fire that consumes all fire. And then he cites a 7th type, which is the fire of the burning bush. Now, what is the fire of the burning bush, to conclude, as we get ready for our evening prayer offering to God? The fire of the burning bush is a fire which Moses sees, but it is not consumed. It's a labah, and the Torah uses the word labat aish, as opposed to the word shalhevet, a flame. And the Midrash says that labah is the language of lev, that this is the heart of fire, which connects to this idea of aish haTorah, that in our heart is a fire. It's a spiritual fire which animates our life, which motivates us to live and to do good. This holy fire, the Piaseczna Rebbe called his book the Aish Kodesh, because of this idea in the Jewish tradition that we have a holy fire that we're supposed to bring into the world. I want to conclude by saying that the lack of balance in the world today, with hundreds of millions of acres burning in the past few years, which is unprecedented in our lifetimes and in hundreds of generations. The world has not seen this type of burning of the boreal forests and the rainforests. This external burning of fire, I would contend, stems from an imbalance within the human being. The crisis in fire and the crisis in nature is actually a spiritual crisis within the human being, of a humanity that is more oriented toward external fire and use of all of the different forms of external fire, which is actually pushing the earth out of balance. And the way to return to balance, I would contend, is for us to access the internal fire, the fire of holiness, the godly fire that God wants us to access and to use for good and holiness in the world. So B'ezrat Hashem, this parsha of Shmot, of Moshe encountering the burning bush, as Rabbi Nachman said, it's not just an ancient story of Moshe doing this, that actually at some level this is a story about each of us, and how do we encounter that burning bush, which is aflame but not consumed.